Get started. We have two speakers today. Our first one is giving his report on his early career faculty award. We spent most of last year working on that, so that'll be very exciting to hear about. So Joe Hartman is an associate professor of art history and Latinx and Latin American studies here at UMKC. He specializes in the visual culture and built environments of the greater Caribbean. His book manuscript, Eye of the Hurricane, Politics of Art, Architecture, and Climate, examines the impact of natural disasters on the Caribbean and political histories. And he actually was preceded there at his recent trip by he got to actually see the results of what a hurricane does. He's author of Dictator's Dreamscape, Architecture and Vision Built Machado.
Yes, Machado.
Machado's Cuba and Invented Modern Havana, and editor of the volume Imperial Islands, Art, Architecture, and Visual Experience in U.S. Insular Empire.
How's everybody doing? Good. So I would like to think everybody can and embrace you and thank you, but unfortunately I caught a little bit of a cold. I was in Washington, D.C. actually yesterday presenting at a conference at the Smithsonian on 1898, Visions and Revisions of American Empire, I think is what it was called. And that has to do with my edited volume, but it's not unrelated to the work that I'm doing, because we'll see that U.S. imperialism, especially on a kind of global scale, starts in 1898, but it continues well into the 20th century as well, and proceeds as well with manifest destiny and doctrine as well. But I'm going to present a little bit about my general research project, which I have to first say thank you to everyone for being a part of it, for supporting me, for actually giving me funding at a really critical moment in the project when I really kind of needed it. I had just gone through the University of Missouri Research Board funding during my sabbatical, and I needed this last bit of funding, particularly because I was working on an article that I'll get into that's related to the book. The book, sorry, what was, I know your name, but Bonnie. Yes, Bonnie. I'm sorry, my brain is all sorts of places, but I know Bonnie well here at the library. But the project, of course, as Bonnie mentioned, is Eye of the Hurricane, Politics of Art, Architecture, and Climate in the Modern Caribbean. But before, and it looks at the impact of hurricanes on art and architecture in the Greater Caribbean, specifically in the 20th century. Before I get too far into that, though, I want to present specifically what the Emeritus College actually funded so that I could go see it. So Bonnie again mentioned Hurricane Fiona struck Puerto Rico. My original intention was to go to a LASA affiliated, that's Latin American Studies Association affiliated conference in Puerto Rico, but it was canceled in part due to the hurricane, and then family health issues sent me like a hurricane back up to Indiana to visit my father. So I decided to pivot and use the funding for this other project that I've been working on, looking at hurricanes in the longue durée, which means, probably I'm talking to an academic crowd, but the idea of hurricanes across time and space. And so that journey, funded with the college, took me to Cuba, specifically to Santiago de Cuba, which is actually a city I hadn't been before. I've done much of my research in Havana, Cuba. I've gone down to the Isle of Pines, which is a little island south of Cuba, to look at a big penitentiary for my first project, but I hadn't actually gotten onto that side of the island, so I was excited to do that. The reason I hadn't is because it is difficult to get there. It's difficult already to get to Havana, but then to get to Santiago de Cuba, you have to get a bus and travel the 10-hour length of the island. So it's not exactly the easiest location to get to. Now I think there are planes that are going down there, but at the time it was still, we were dealing with pandemic protocols, and also Cuba right now is in the midst of another really terrible economic depression. which is also part of the reason that we saw the revolution or the partial revolution of people protesting the Cuban government's handling of things. So I took that bus trip down to Santiago de Cuba, and I got to see. I had read about only in a book from the 1950s by a Cuban kind of polymath, Fernando Ortiz. Some of you may have heard of him. He coins this idea of transculturation. Two cultures meet together, and asymmetrically, there's a creation of a new culture. And he wrote this book called Hurricane, and it was all about this imagery of the hurricane. He starts by looking at these artifacts, which recently I found an article where some of these images were published in low quality, but I actually, outside of that book, up until when a group of Cuban scientists, anthropologists had published their material, I'd never actually seen the images. I wasn't sure it existed. It was in a museum called the Emeritus Museum. Yes, that Bacardi. He started his rum manufacturing of Havana rum in Cuba, and in the 19th century. And his family had a large collection of strange and kind of esoteric artifacts, Napoleonic artifacts, these ancient Caribbean artifacts. And because of the kind of the nature of how it was spread around Cuba, I wasn't sure if they were there. So I went to the museum. I had the support of the Institute of History in Cuba. So I had some letters that made it look official. And indeed, I discovered that these two objects and several others were actually there at the museum. Now, these are really remarkable in terms of the history of hurricanes, because they actually show us the earliest known representations of a god known as Huracán in the Taino tradition. These are pre-Taino artifacts. So what exactly they mean, this was Fernando Ortiz's grappling. Could it be a figure in dance? Could it be an image of birth? But what we're actually seeing, he argues, is the image of a hurricane. And what's really remarkable about that, and part of it, he bases this on the figure of Guamancex, who is the mother of hurricanes, and she is the birther of Huracán. And here we see her in this kind of prurient motion of childbirth. And what's also remarkable about these images, we can get them to hold steady here for a second, is that what's really remarkable about these images is actually they show us indigenous knowledge in a very profound way. Often kind of cast aside in colonialist accounts, and even in the development of meteorology. I spoke to meteorologists in Havana just recently who couldn't believe that these were necessarily representations of hurricanes based on what Ortiz was saying. And part of that had to do with that meteorologist's opinion that hurricanes cannot be observed. Hurricanes are not, observable on the ground. So how would you know what they look like? And why do I think this looks like a hurricane at all? Is because actually, if you look at these arms, they're going in a very particular motion, very particular pattern. It's not a effect, which is that that wind will swirl counterclockwise in the north, and they will swirl clockwise in the south. And I would actually argue against the meteorologist who I met with, or he's actually not a meteorologist, he's a meteorological historian. He was an expert actually on Padre Viñales, who was a progenitor of meteorological practice worldwide, and he's a Cuban himself. Because the Spanish also were able to record the ways that winds moved based on how the trees would fall in a certain pattern. So they're really remarkable objects, in short, based on the fact that these are the earliest representations of hurricanes that we know of. That I'm going to go with the 1950 anthropologists and some other recent anthropologists who agree with them on that. And they're also remarkable because they give us an insight into indigenous knowledge and also how hurricanes have had an art depicting hurricanes, art and architecture that is made after hurricanes has had such a tremendous impact on Caribbean art and culture. as well as development of science and other many facets of humanity in the region. Would have significant and which has significance for us now, right? And that's ultimately the argument of the project. In fact, why does this matter? Well, part of it matters is because of the destruction that we saw after Hurricane Maria in 2017. And part of my argument is that disasters are natural events on one hand, but very often the disaster itself is actually the cultural response after. We saw that after New Orleans, for example, and the police brutality and the reports of looting, which actually match reports of looting after the Galveston hurricane in 1900, which allowed white supremacists to start shooting men, particularly men of color. Black and brown bodies were put under threat of the rifle in support of white supremacy because of these reports that were talking about looting and dangers that followed the storm. So very often the story of the disaster is not always just the hurricane. The hurricane may be the precipitating moment of that disaster. And certainly in the case of these indigenous Caribbeans and in this indigenous art, that's also we're seeing before the disaster of colonization and the conquest. There are other objects that I went to see, which is actually part of my larger project. So I'm focusing on the 1920s and 1930s. So this is an urn that's erected for Cuba's Secretary of Public Works, Carlos Miguel Cespedes, after the storm. But of course, his regime was known as they were U.S. backed, supported by deep-pocketed U.S. banks, and brutal in their repression of labor. So the hurricane, in their case, presented an opportunity to literally see the power through public works and architecture. And then I met some colleagues there as well here, an artist who works in this image of the polar bear in Cuba, in Santiago, Cuba. The polar bear is kind of an icon of Russian northern invasion in Cuba, sort of out of placeness of the polar bear. And then Jose Choi, who's a famous architect here. So I'm going to really go very quickly, I guess, into the rest of the project, just to give you guys an overview. So I have the Hurricane Politics, Art, Architecture, and Climate focuses on the 1920s and 1930s. And the reason I focus on that period is because this actually was the worst decade of storms in the Caribbean recorded history. It also happens to be where I get my entry point with the material, because I first encountered this image while I was doing my first book on the Chaves Cuba, because it's a hurricane that blows through and destroys Havana in 1926. And as I mentioned, allows for a literal cementing of power, building prisons, a Capitol building in the vein of the United States Capitol, recreating the monument to the Maine, which precipitated the War of 1898, and the kind of the cultural disaster that follows in the form of a brutal dictatorship that bills itself as benevolent. I'm a dictatorship built with benefits. Look at all the things that I built afterwards. And I discovered repeating images. There's a famous Caribbean scholar that talks about the Isla que se repite, the repeating island. And we can see that here in sort of the early history of disaster capitalism that follows these storms. These images are all created at the height of surrealism. So what we're looking at too is the uncanny, upsetting of the real, the normal. And these are actually not the same tree. This is Puerto Rico in 1928 after San Felipe, and this is the Dominican Republic after San Zenón in 1930. And my argument here is that all of these tremendous meteorological events also give us insight into the role of art and architecture, both the limits of it and the possibilities of it in responding to climate disasters, which I think should have intrinsic meaning for all of us in 2023. So I mentioned Machado, and these are some of the public works that are built by the U.S. Government or the U.S. Empire, U.S. Imperial government after the storm of 1928 and 1932. The three buildings that they mentioned, that the Department of Interior mentions that survived the storm of 28, that they're most concerned about are the Capitol building, Manicomio, which is a mental health facility, then they would call it an asylum, and the presidio, the prison. So kind of ripped straight from the pages of Food Belt, right? These a discourse of power is what they're most concerned about. And then in the case of Trujillo, Rafael Trujillo, one of the worst strongmen in Caribbean history, he actually he just took possession of office, and the storm blows through that destroys much of Santo Domingo. It's a huge tragedy, huge destructive force, and very, very deadly. Thousands lost their lives. And Trujillo uses this storm in a way very similar to what Machado and the U.S. government does, but he goes a step farther and literally renames Santo Domingo as Ciudad Prodigio, Prodigio City, after that storm. And you can see the sort of using kind of the obelisk, the neoclassical discourse, but then also this brutalist kind of fascistic architecture as well. And those are sort of the repeating tragedies that I'm interested in unpacking, in the hopes that they won't be repeated, and also to think about the hopeful pessimism of hurricanes as generative possibility. A lot of times, governments, for example, in the 16th and 17th century, were concerned about revolts and uprisings after hurricanes. And that's something that I look at. But very often, the hurricane was often a moment for those with power to mint power. Though sometimes that's not the case. Accounts of the Haitian Revolution, though apocryphal, for example, will talk about there being a storm on the night of Blanc Hamon, which is the night that there's a voting ceremony that begins the revolution that eventually forms the nature of Haiti. And that actually is what gets me into the book that I went to Cuba for, or excuse me, the article that I went to Cuba for with Emeritus funding, which is looking at hurricanes as chronotopes. This is a term from Russian literary polymath Mikhail Bakhtin, time, space, and hurricanes as these moments that reveal repetitions, you might say, fissures, rupture in time and space. So it starts with this image from Puerto Rico, Plena. This is an image by Rafael Trujillo, and the Plena itself was actually created after our 1928 Samba de Mundo. It was made in 1929 by anonymous musicians. It goes something like temporal, temporal, que tremendo temporal, 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 que terrible temporal, que será de Puerto Rico cuando pase el temporal, que será de mi Puerto Rico cuando pase el temporal. The tempest, the terrible tempest. These are lines that echo throughout the history of the Caribbean, but yeah, the lines roughly translate to what will become of Puerto Rico what will become of my Boricua, which is the indigenous state of Puerto Rico, when the storm passes. Which is a kind of entry point that I use to consider what becomes of us, in the age of global climate change, ruined when the storm passes by. And so that gets us back into, what I do is I trace a history roughly chronologically, though I start here in the 1950s, going from the petromonuments that we were looking at made by indigenous peoples, and then going into the earliest representation of hurricanes in the 15th and 16th century, and then also, of course, Shakespeare's Tempest and representations of that in the 18th and 19th century. There's less visual documentation, but I talk also about the Age of Revolution. You do see images of sinking ships, for example. And speaking of revolution, there's a terrible hurricane in 1780 that destroys a huge fleet of French and British forces that are coming to either aid or thwart the U.S. rebellion, which then allows for this moment to, for our very nation to be formed potentially. The hurricane has a role to play in that cultural formation. And this is this mural that Trujillo also created various planas in Puerto Rican history. There, he's critiquing U.S. and Spanish colonialism, and above it, we see the sickly hand of the storm god that is El Temporal. But of course, the storm god looks much different in these indigenous artifacts. What's remarkable, though, is talking about indigenous knowledge. I'm showing here a bolio, which is built in the round out of bejuco climbing vines and alsubo wood, which the British would call ironwood because of its strength. So these were very hard structures actually to knock down for the technology that they had. Unfortunately, and also they're in the round, which, the geodesic dome is actually a stronger shape against hurricane force winds. So we're seeing kind of knowledge that's lost in this chapter when the Spanish arrive. Here we see, colonizers looking at the sky with arquebuses strung, slewing about, and they seem to be looking to God. Why are you punishing me? Meanwhile, in the background, we have more knowledgeable indigenous people huddling under the rocks because they have an idea of what is to come. And the idea of the storm as divine punishment is something that as a divine interlocutor is something that goes through multiple, including the indigenous works that we're looking at. And here we're looking at a frontispiece for Shakespeare's The Tempest. So this, this allows me kind of an entry point into the idea of the storm also as a cultural concept. Here the storm is literally invented. It's a human creation, which gets us kind of into the industrial era. And J.W. Turner's The Slave Ship, originally called Typhoon, slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, which is actually a abolitionist piece of abolitionist literature of a typhoon that is actually fictionalized by the ship owner of the Zong. He wants to collect insurance, and in his bloody trade throws over his own cargo, human cargo of people. And so Turner's image is, Mark Twain has critiques of it that are quite astounding too, is this, gorgeous orange sunset. But in the foreground, we see the shackled legs drowning in these waters. So it's a very powerful movement of how these disasters are used. Natural disasters are used as an impetus for broader cultural disasters that we've been experiencing for many centuries, millennia. And Winslow Homer is also invested in this discourse too. This is the Gulf Stream, and here we see a storm on the horizon. I think we have Talking Jacob over it, but you can see a Hurricane cirrus cloud rising up, and we have the image of the figure who's surrounded by sharks. He's got a storm coming, and there's a distant ship. We don't know if it's going to rescue him or not, but it's a not too thinly veiled critique and representation of the danger to Black men during Homer's time in the 19th century. So it was also abolitionism. And then we see in Puerto Rico here, Carlos Raquel Rivera's critiques of U.S. imperialism, how in this case this is Huracán del Norte. So we're seeing, this hurricane money bags falling out. The Puerto Rican people desperately clinging to it. And in more modern era representations, we have Teresita Fernandez's representation that looks like it could be a Google image search photo of the event of Irma, Maria, and Harvey. And I could go at length with this, but I see I'm running out of time. But we'll get into Gabriela Torres Ferrer's work, which is also a critique of the U.S. response after Hurricane Maria, which here it says it's a poster board for down power line. It's a poster board talking about voter rights, but so it's saying value your citizenship, valora tu ciudadanía, but she renames it valora tu entera americana as her protest of the U.S. response, and also of the depiction of Puerto Ricans themselves as literally powerless. So much emphasis is put on the power, electrical power going out, but so much of that is also tied to this more painful history that goes back 500 years in the oldest colony in the world. And yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Sorry it took a little longer than expected, but I appreciate your guys' time, and we'll be happy to take any questions you might want to do with me.